Hi there, good morning. You're welcome to Business Time. My name is Kemini Amanor. This week, we want to look at the case of India, the transformational growth that this country has gone through, and pick out the lessons the African continent, or countries within the African continent, could draw from there. We'll also bring you the business news that made rounds over the week and activities on the commodities and forex markets. Business Time is brought to you in association with Lady Foods and Giant Malt, empowered by the Business and Financial Times newspaper. My name is Kemini Amanor. So there you have it, the major stories that made rounds over the week. It's time now for us to get into our conversation for this week. We'll talk about the case of India, where it started from, where it got to now, and what lessons the African continent or countries on the African continent could draw from the Indian experience. To help us do that is Professor Ayaz Shafi. He likes to describe himself as a learning facilitator, and he's here in the country with us today. Thank you very much for joining us here, Prof. But let's get an understanding of where India started from.
Well, 70 years ago, nearly 70 years ago now, we began as a nobody in economic terms. We had our own kind of crisis. We were struggling in terms of, we were just coming out of a very horrendous partition, an experience which everybody would want to forget, where two major religious groups were divided, and India was divided into two nations, two countries, Pakistan and India. So everything was kind of difficult for us at that time. But if you look at the situation now, and when you compare India with a number of countries that were born around the same time in Asia and in Africa, well, I could proudly say that we're far, far ahead.
I guess.
Yeah, and primarily I would want to give credit for that to our leaders over the 70 years. And this, well, I'm not claiming that our leaders were saints and angels. They were not. They were real men, and they were as good as or as bad as leaders in any other parts of the world. But one thing that was a common thread across these leaders that we had for the last 70 years was the vision that they had. And you could, in terms of economic and social development of India, you could divide Indian economic and social history into three segments. The first phase of about 20 years, till the time we had the Chinese-Indochina War, the first Indochina War. And then you have the second phase, till the time we opened a market, the liberal economy that we generated after that. And then the later phase, the last phase that we are into, last 20, 25 years or so. And the first phase primarily was when the leadership was protecting the Indian economy. And the focus was on building infrastructure for the future. So you had a huge amount of investment being made, and in collaboration with Germany, in collaboration with Russia, we were sitting with steel plants. Because steel was necessary for setting with infrastructure and the facilities. So we set up steel plants around that time. And these steel plants were told, the mandate was that you don't need to worry about profitability. You need to make sure that you produce enough so that we have enough steel to set up whatever we have to set up. That was the basic mandate. Worked wonderfully well actually for us. The other area that was focused upon was education. So you had IITs, Indian Institute of Technology, and IIMs, Indian Institute of Management, being set up in the 60s. And the idea was to create a talent pool which would take India forward. Create a generation of young men and women who would lead India in business and in technology. And, well, not all claims, but you can see it. I mean, every major organization has some Indian or the other in some senior position across the world. I mean, I'm not talking India. So you look at any major organization and they're all there. I don't want to name them, but they're all there. It's run by Indians. And the fact of the matter is these IITs and IIMs produce some of the finest brains. So that was in the first stage of our growth and development, so to say. when you look at the late 60s and till the time we were in the early 80s, that band, in the early years we were importing a lot of food grains. So the first challenge for us was to stop that because it was draining it was a drain on the economy, buying food grain from other countries. There was something called the Green Revolution that happened in the late 60s, early 70s. And India came to a level where it could produce enough to sustain itself. There was also a white revolution, which meant that we were producing enough milk for ourselves. And these were basic requirements at that point in time. But it also meant that we were protecting our economy to such a level where a lot of luxuries that were available to the rest of the world, to the developed economy, and even to some of the poorer countries, because they were allowed to import a lot of these products, were not available to us. So for a soap, Camay was a luxury in India. You wouldn't get Camay soap off the shelf. You wouldn't get a Brut off the shelf.
But at that time, did India have its own, perhaps, soap manufacturing company? Did you have a substitute at the time you were cutting off the imports?
We did, but it was not at par in terms of quality. And that was the reason our economy was protected. That was the reason why the duty was so very high. It was prohibitively high, actually. The idea was to protect our manufacturers and our manufacturing units. Now, the point I'm making is that the competition wasn't there. We were protected, our manufacturers were protected, our manufacturing units were protected, our business was protected. The idea was to bring us to a level where we can compete with the global products. We could go out in the world and say, okay, this is what we have to offer, which is what we are doing right now. So that happened.
Professor Shafi, take us through the third phase of growth for India.
Okay, you see, it's a funny thing because we got into this situation because of certain difficulties. In the early 90s, we were in debt. We owed a whole lot. We had to borrow a lot of money from IMF and World Bank. And it was called a sell-out by the opposition party then. But in that environment, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was then the finance minister, is an economist. And he, in his wisdom, felt that India needs to just simply open its doors to foreign investment. Till that time, we had a lot of restrictions in terms of investment and how much a profit you could take out of India. Now, all those barriers were broken down. And we entered what we call the liberal economy phase. But there's a background to it. You could say that the ground was prepared somewhere in the mid-80s when Rajiv Gandhi, and I've talked about the vision of our leaders, he was the Prime Minister for only 5 years, but in that single stint of his, the man had a vision, and he said if we have to move into the 21st century, we need to move with the technology. And what he did in the process was to make sure that the infrastructure for IT was there for India. So I remember I was in college those days, and there was a time when he declared that every single day we would set up one transmitter in some district of the country. And what these transmitters did was to link the entire country. We are a large country, both in terms of population and size. Now today, if you go to the remotest part of the country, you pull out your mobile phone, you'll find the network there, and it's thanks to those towers. And
this was a decision taken in the 80s.
In the 80s. And the man had a vision. So what was happening then was we created a talent pool in terms of IT, and that started inviting what you call business process outsourcing. So we got into that space as well, and we created a niche for ourselves. So today India is identified more as an has a talent pool of IT than anything else. It has moved from the time of half-naked fakir kind of label that we had earned earlier. But when you look at the present situation, what has happened in the last so many years, about 20-25 years is this, we simply opened up to all the foreign investors, right? And lately, some sectors were barred from foreign investment. The investment was limited, but even that has opened up now. Now we are moving into another era, actually. And if you look at this era, we are saying the incumbent Prime Minister, he has introduced something which he calls Make in India, which means foreigners would invest, there would be a lot of foreign investment in the country, they would set a plant and industry, and products and goods would be exported out of India. And what it would do is it would, of course, bring in foreign investment. That is one. The second part would be it would generate a lot of employment as well. And that's important right now for India, because there is a segment which is beginning to feel restless right now. And employment at that level is becoming an issue. So while you have a very strong middle class, which is well off, comfortable, there's this growing segment, which is growing in terms of numbers itself, which is feeling a little disenchanted, feeling a little hard done by, because opportunities are limited. So there is this requirement of setting up manufacturing units, which would allow more and more employment to happen. I think we are right there. We are on the throes of growing bigger, actually, if you ask me.
I want to take you back a little at the point where India also had its own situation with the kind of loans it was contracting, if you had to bring in the IMF and the World Bank. If you can compare that to the current state of many African countries. Why do you think that in spite of African countries running to all these world financial institutions, at the end of the day, we are not able to achieve what we set out to do? It only lasts, the effects of the loans and the credibility of policies we get from, for instance, the IMF or the World Bank only last for a while. There's no sustainability. Why is this so for the African continent?
I think the fundamental problem is with a long-term plan. We had a series of plans, and every government would introduce something which is called a 5-year plan. And what it meant was, for the next 5 years, these are the key things that we are going to focus. The fund allocation would happen primarily at that level. The annual budget would be there, but apart from that, you knew right in the beginning of a government's taking charge that this is where the monies are going to go, right? So even World Bank and IMF, those institutions would know where the funding is going to go, whatever money they are allocating. Trust was there. I think in the other factor was, before I go into the African context, the other fact is that the two major Indian parties, political parties, the Bharatiya Janata Party and the Congress Party, their economic philosophy is more or less the same. They're both right of center, right? One is a little more right than the other one, but both of them are right of center. Now, the fact is that they have continued the economic policies pursued by the other party. So when you had the Congress in power, they initiated certain policies. They said, this is what we are going to do. When BJP comes to power, it practically continues with the same thing. So the continuity has always been there. This has not been disrupted. Although there have been a couple of breaks in between, very short 2 years, 2.5 years break, but that hasn't impacted anything. To my mind, in most of the African countries, that continuity hasn't been there. So even the institutions that lend out these monies to different countries, they aren't very sure. So for example, today you have a particular party in power in country A in Africa. You don't know when the party would be thrown out of power. That's problem one. Whether an army would take over or whether there would be a coup, you aren't very sure. You're never very sure. And if somebody else comes to power, the general understanding is that the policy pursued by the previous government would be overturned. I think that's the challenge. So unless Ghana has that advantage, let me say that to you. Ghana has that advantage in the sense that there has been this, the democracy has thrived, it has been strengthening itself. I'm not very sure about the continuity of policy in terms of water allocation has to be done, focus areas and so on. But the fact is that if there is this continuity which is built into the political system, in terms of what is to be followed for the economic development of the country, I think you should be able to deal with it right. So Africa as a continent really need to look at consistency and continuity in its economic policies. There have been too many disruptions, if you really ask me.
You're watching Business Time. My name is Kemini, Amanor. This week we're having a conversation with Professor Ayaz Shafi. He's a learning facilitator in the world of business, really. And we're talking about the case of India as far as economic growth is concerned. We want to find out what lessons we could draw from the Indian society. Don't go away. Welcome back to Business Time. This week we are having a conversation with Professor Ayaz Shafi. We want to discuss the India transformational growth, and we want to find out also what lessons we could draw from it. We've had most of the conversation already. At this point, India was also able to rope in the private sector. Sure. What role did the private sector play in this transformational growth?
I think the private sector in India has been critical, and nurturing the private sector was probably the wisest decision that our first Prime Minister made. That protectionist policy that we pursued in the first 35 years of independence was critical. So you had these organizations, and you see them outside India now, you see them all over the world now. Tata's, for example, Reliance, for example. These were all fledgling organizations at one point in time. They were all local organizations. They were all just Indian organizations. But because they were nurtured and protected largely by the government, they grew into these giant corporate organizations, global organizations. I just saw this news item which says that Tata's are intending to pull out of UK. They want to shut down their UK operations. And the Prime Minister and the Cabinet has to go into a meeting. That's the impact of one Indian organization pulling out of a Western economy. And that's how we have grown. So if you look at it this way, that in the early years, the protection that was given to the Indian industry and business houses was crucial. If we had thrown our doors open at that point in time, probably these organizations couldn't have survived.
The African has been given a number of excuses, including the fact that, look, although we consume a lot of foreign goods, we can't cut them off because we do not have substitutes enough for you. The African has been told that we can't do without the aid that people from the West give us. The African has been told that the funds do not exist for us to simply do what it is. The government says if it has very little money, it needs to invest somewhere else, perhaps in social duties, than give to the private sector. Now, in the African context, as it is, are these excuses justifiable? Because India went through the same process.
Yes, I would like to make a political comment, honestly. But if you're asking me, the ways of dealing with it, and at least one nation has dealt with it very right, I would say. We have dealt with it very right. And I'm not saying it because I'm an Indian, but even if you look at it from outside, you understand that we have dealt with it very, very right. I think you need to identify your priorities. You need to say that this is what we will have to do, this is what we will have to forego. Just to give you an example, the products that we used in the first 30-40 years of our independence were substandard. We know that. You couldn't have compared a car produced in India with any car anywhere in the world. Even Bangladesh had better cars than India had at that point in time, right? But Bangladesh was importing those cars. We were making our own cars. And these cars were not comparable, actually. But today, if you look at it, we have these organizations coming in, setting up their plants in India. And that's where the difference is. So we did forego a lot of things in the early years. We did face hardships in the first few years of our independence. And that has taken us where we are now. So Africa as a continent, African countries need to make that decision.
One could argue also that India has the numbers, but as individual African countries, we don't. Except for maybe Nigeria?
Yes, but I don't know why Africa sees itself as different countries. To me, the way I look at it, Africa is actually one nation. It's a massive nation.
So how do we leverage that?
I think something along the line, although European Union itself is crumbling, so to say, because it has certain shortcomings, but something along you have ECOWAS kind of thing in place, but I wonder how strong it is and how strongly it operates. I think you have to have a pan-Africa approach, but most importantly, you need to facilitate movement of people from one region to another. Your biggest challenge, particularly in the southern part of the continent, is the xenophobia that you have. I mean, somewhere that fear has to be addressed. You need to come out of this mindset of being different identities within Africa. You need to create one African identity. I want to share this with you, that India is a very diverse nation, very, very diverse nation. You have ethnic groups, you have religious groups, you have cultural groups, you have linguistic groups. We speak more than 400 dialects. And we have so many different religious belief systems within the religion that we follow. So within Hinduism, there are certain sects which are very different from one another. Within Muslims, there are different sects which are very different from one another. Now, despite all that, we identify ourselves as Indians. And that's probably where we are different from the rest of the world. That identity has brought us whatever it has brought us. So I think somewhere you need to create an African identity. And if you can do that, that should work for you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shafi, for coming. It's been absolutely insightful speaking to you. I've learned a lot about India, and I hope the managers of our economy have also picked a few pointers from the case of India as far as their transformational growth is concerned. Still to come here are activities over the week on the commodities and forex markets. Don't go away.